My name's Lewis O'Brien. For the last 20 plus years, I've been helping property investors to achieve their goals. In this special one-off 5-minute guide, we're going to look at the recently announced small and medium enterprise commercial leasing principles during COVID-19. In simple terms, we're going to look at what the recent policy announced by the government means during the coronavirus restrictions for both landlords and tenants of commercial properties. In this 5-minute guide, we're going to examine the purpose of the scheme, the parties, i.e. who's eligible for the scheme, the principles behind it, the relevant dates, and then work through an example, hopefully to try and illustrate and make some sense of what is part of the government's hibernation strategy. Again, the purpose of this program is to try and give effect to the government's concept of economic hibernation during the coronavirus restrictions. The idea being that somehow we can put everything on pause and come back with minimal damage once the virus has been dealt with. I must admit that I've got some doubts about how successful this is going to be, but as a concept, I think it's a step in the right direction. In practice, what this means is that we're expecting landlords to provide some rent relief. Part of that will come in the form of waivers, i.e. forgiveness of rent. Part of it will come in the form of deferrals. To put all of this in context, I also think it's worth making the point that the law probably doesn't give tenants a lot of relief. Very few leases have strict force majeure clauses, and on the other hand, the tenant still has the benefit of the lease. It's just in practice, they can't trade from the premises or their trade has been interrupted, none of which is strictly the landlord's fault. So traditional law doesn't deal with this issue particularly well, hence the need for a program like the one we're seeing here. Importantly, this program won't apply to all leases. At this point, it's limited to cases where we've got a commercial lease and the tenant is eligible for the JobKeeper program. So in simple terms, it's a business that has a turnover of less than $50 million and also has a 30% or greater reduction in their turnover. It's worth noting that this $50 million threshold will be applied to franchisee at the franchise level, not the group level. But on the other hand, individual stores that are part of a group will still be subject to this $50 million threshold. In trying to resolve how the tenants' basic losses are to be apportioned between the parties, the code sets out a number of principles. Basically, there's an expectation that landlords and tenants will sit down in good faith, have a discussion, share some information, and have a reasonable negotiation. The policy does provide some guidelines. The idea is that a tenant's rent should be reduced in the same proportion as their turnover has fallen. However, this rent reduction is to be apportioned between two components. The first component is a waiver or write-off, so the tenant will get a rent reduction. The second half, which can be up to half of the reduction, is in the form of a deferral. That is, that part of the rent will be deferred and paid at some point in the future, and the idea of a 2-year type program after the coronavirus restrictions have been raised is set out in the policy. In the interim, landlords are not entitled to raise any additional fees. They shouldn't be evicting tenants. They shouldn't be trying to pass on rent increases or make claims against tenants' bonds or other securities. Landlords should also be sharing any benefits they get from banks in terms of loan repayments or potentially land tax relief. Finally, there's an expectation that the actual lease term will be extended by the duration of the corona restrictions to try and put the tenant back in the same position they were in before the restrictions began. The commencement date for this program is not entirely clear, as the provisions haven't been passed by the Victorian Parliament, but we're expecting a date somewhere in the vicinity of late March, early April as a commencement date. The program will cease with the expiry of the JobKeeper program, which is presently scheduled for somewhere around 30 September 2020. Depending on how the virus situation evolves, there is some prospect that these dates may be extended. To try and provide a practical illustration of all of this, let's talk through a concrete example. The client owns a building that's tenanted to a florist. The florist has unfortunately suffered a circa 60% drop in their turnover as a result of the coronavirus restrictions. The tenant is therefore entitled to seek, under these policies, a 60% rent reduction. Out of that 60%, 30% must be in the form of a waiver. The other 30% may be in the form of a deferral. The tenant is also entitled to ask for, at this stage, a 6-month extension of their lease with no rent increases. The tenant is also entitled to ask whether the landlord has received land tax concessions or concessions from the landlord's mortgagee, in which case the tenant may be entitled to slightly more by way of concessions. To round out this video, I want to make the obvious point that I've tried to summarize in a simple form the major features of this new proposal. It does rely a great deal on goodwill between the parties. And one of the obvious gaps is what happens if either the tenant is looking for an excuse to exit a lease or a landlord's just not interested in being negotiable. Those issues are supposed to be referred to the Small Business Commissioner. It is intended that the Small Business Commissioner will then be able to impose some sort of binding mediation process. Obviously, there's a little bit of uncertainty about how this process might work, as the Victorian legislation hasn't been enacted yet. Obviously, this 5-minute guide is not intended to be a comprehensive and exhaustive overview of the topic, and it's not a substitute for professional advice that's tailored to your specific circumstances. Any changes to the lease or agreed variations should be recorded in writing, and it may be in some cases that some legal advice is required, either just to review what's been agreed or alternatively to put things like personal guarantees and other concessions into an enforceable document. Naturally, Lewis O'Brien and Associates stands ready to assist those clients and other investors and tenants who may require assistance navigating their way through this difficult time and these provisions as they continue to evolve. I hope you've enjoyed this video and got some value out of the advice and ideas that we've provided. If that's the case, please subscribe either to our YouTube channel or to our newsletter from our website, and don't forget to like this video. Whilst at this stage this is a one-off video, we do expect to have a new series of videos in relation to commercial property investing coming your way soon. Thank you.